Welcome to the Archaeology Studio. Today's episode considers how to distinguish among theory, hypothesis, and fantasy in science generally and in archaeology specifically. In ordinary daily speech, people often blur the distinction between a theory and a hypothesis, but people generally do recognize that these words function differently in a formal philosophy of science. News media and other popular information outlets have used the word theory to replace the word hypothesis. Moreover, this more liberal use of the word theory has grown to accommodate not only a hypothesis but also a fantasy. This presentation reviews the basic definitions of theory, hypothesis, and fantasy for general use and for application in archaeology. A theory involves an intellectual framework that accounts for how and why the world exists and operates as it does. A theoretical framework allows the production of various ideas about the world. Some of those ideas can be expressed in the forms of proposals about how things could work. Those proposals are known as hypotheses that can be tested. A fantasy is similar to a theoretical framework about how and why the world functions, except that a fantasy involves a premise about the world that is known to be false or fictional. Within a fantasy framework, a hypothesis cannot be proven or disproven. Rather, any observations and circumstances can be interpreted or reinterpreted in accordance with the known fictional premise of the fantasy. One of the key concepts here involves the interrelated roles of theory, method, and technique in a general philosophy of science. You may have seen my other videos in this channel that already have addressed these issues. Just briefly here, I can summarize that a theory involves an intellectual framework about how the world came to exist and why things operate as they do. In this sense, a body of theory or a theoretical framework can generate new ideas, such as a hypothesis about how and why things exist in the world. Ideally, a hypothesis can be tested using techniques of gathering primary data from the real world, combined with method of analyzing and interpreting the data sets. Most importantly, the method creates a logical link between the data gathering of a technique and the hypothesis generation of a theory in a manner that supports testing of a hypothesis. In this formulation, a hypothesis can be proven to be correct or incorrect. The result can allow refinement not only of the specific hypothesis, but also of the larger intellectual framework of a theory. Already now in this presentation, you can see that a theory can generate many different ideas, and some of those ideas can be expressed as hypotheses. If a hypothesis can be tested, then the larger theory potentially can become viable as part of a scientific discipline that involves theory, method, and technique. A theory can propose a what-if scenario about the world. For instance, in geology, a few different theoretical perspectives have proposed variable what-if scenarios about the nature of change through time. All of these theories started with knowing that geological formations have changed, yet they proposed different ideas to account for those changes. The theory of catastrophism had proposed what if rare and dramatic events of catastrophe had shaped the world's geology, such as through earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and floods. Hypothetically, a catastrophe might have released a major force and thereby caused a massive change as a singular event, followed by an extended long time period of mostly stable conditions or perhaps a few lingering small-scale effects. This hypothesis appears to be true in some but not all cases of earthquakes, and it does not account for many other aspects of geological change, such as in soil formation processes. Another theory of gradualism had proposed what if geological processes overall have been slow but continuous through time. In this view, a hypothesis might relate with an overall steady and gradual soil formation process. Indeed, this hypothesis can be proven as accurate for most cases of soil formation, but it does not account for all of the broader diversity of geological change. Another theoretical perspective in geology has been known as Uniformitarianism. In this theory, the principles of geology have remained constant or uniform through time. The specific output, though, has been variable in terms of the rate and the magnitude of change. Some things change more quickly than others. Some things change more dramatically than others. The principles driving those changes, however, are constant and predictable, hence the word uniform as in uniformitarianism. Specific observations in the geological world could have resulted from catastrophe or gradual change, but uniformitarianism shifts the theoretical focus onto the geological principles. The theoretical framework of uniformitarianism allowed geologists to propose formal hypotheses about how geological formations and sedimentary units have developed through variable time spans. According to this theoretical framework, one important hypothesis has been about how sedimentary units have accumulated, eroded, and undergone various processes according to the same principles of geology throughout the world's geological history. Through repeated observations about how sedimentary units have formed around the world, geological research has been able to confirm several hypotheses, for instance, including the principle of superposition of sedimentary layers through time, now known as the law of superposition. The law of superposition in geology has been essential for the discipline of archaeology to identify stratigraphic layers in chronological order. Based on these lessons from geology, archaeologists have been able to propose countless hypotheses about chronological sequences of cultural history throughout the world. A viable hypothesis needs to be compatible with the known chronological order of stratigraphic layers and all of the associated cultural artifacts and attributes in the same chronological order. If a hypothesis ignores these parameters, then the starting premise already can be rejected as anachronistic, and it never can be proven. In archaeology, theoretical frameworks have been borrowed not only from geology but also from general social sciences. Knowledge from geology is essential for developing hypotheses about the basic practicalities of archaeology. Meanwhile, knowledge from general social sciences can be helpful for developing hypotheses about how to interpret the social meaning of artifacts and sites in the archaeological record. At this point in the presentation, you can appreciate how a theory and a hypothesis relate with each other, yet they refer to different parts of a logical thought process. I will not review every theory and hypothesis in archaeology during this one video. Rather, I hope to clarify that a theory is an intellectual framework that allows the formulation of a hypothesis or perhaps multiple hypotheses. A theoretician or a philosopher could propose a what-if scenario, and then, logically, several other conditions would need to follow accordingly. Some of those conditions could be phrased as hypotheses. If a hypothesis can be tested and proven to be true or false, then it can contribute productively to refine a theory and to advance general understanding of science. For instance, a theoretical perspective could posit that natural history and cultural history have evolved or co-evolved together as complex systems. Within this theoretical perspective, several hypotheses could be proposed about finding correlations between environmental factors and cultural factors in the archaeological record. One such hypothesis would suggest that every instance of a change in sea level through time corresponded with an equivalent change in cultural behaviors of how people lived in coastal environments. Relevant evidence for testing this hypothesis could be found in any of the world's coastal sites, specifically within measurable stratigraphic layers associated with known periods of changing sea level in the past. This hypothesis has been proven to be accurate in multiple cases around the world and in numerous different time periods. On the other hand, if a hypothesis starts with a faulty premise, or if it simply cannot be tested through real evidence, then it cannot make a productive contribution in science. These kinds of hypotheses could be rejected as non-viable and in some cases as illogical for scientific disciplines. They can, however, support fantasy frameworks. Works of science fiction and fantasy can function only in their imaginary forms. These imaginary forms may be regarded as fantasy settings or as fantasy world-building settings. The core concept here involves a what-if scenario that is known to be fictional, and then everything else about this fictional setting can be imagined or interpreted according to those fictional guidelines. The most successful works in science fiction and fantasy start with a single and simple what-if premise, such as, what if dinosaurs did not become extinct? Or, what if electricity had not been invented? When numerous what-if premises and conditions are combined, then the results can become more and more complicated, inconsistent, and unpredictable. In any case, an inconsistent fantasy breaks the expectation of verisimilitude or the ability to sustain its logic within its own boundaries. The premise of a fantasy setting can be understood as a fictional what-if scenario, but then the other details would need to follow the same logic consistently. At its core, a what-if scenario can support new ways of thinking about the world. This approach has been useful for developing new scientific theories, such as Einstein's theory of relativity, as well as string theory in physics. When those theories produce hypotheses that are tested and proven to be accurate according to real-life evidence, then those theories can become viable as parts of valid scientific paradigms. In contrast, proposals that are untestable or that contradict observable evidence can be regarded as fantasy narratives, and at least one key aspect can be identified as a fictional premise. In concluding this episode, I hope that I have encouraged new thoughts about theory, hypothesis, and fantasy in general, and in archaeology specifically. How would you apply these issues in your work, and what more could be developed? Please remember to subscribe to this channel, share with your friends, and explore more online videos with the Archaeology Studio.